there are two fans in the general vicinity? Why is my window open? You can hear birds chirping. Why do I not have any pants on and I'm recording a video in my boxers? And the answer to all those questions is, mind your business. Moving on. So, I watched a video a few days ago of someone comparing various tournament arcs. And because it's 2019 and we're uninspired dickheads, they were comparing Naruto's tuning exams and My Hero Academia's sports festival arc. That's not a tournament arc. Well, yeah, it is. Sure, it is. We just don't call it that because it's 2019 and we can't have that. The arc came out before that. Mind your business. So, with that being stated, I looked at that video and went, hey, that's a cool video. And then I went, hey, the outcome was obvious already because you're comparing a cake to a cupcake. They both taste good, but one is clearly better. And granted, it's not like Kishimoto really followed up on the promise of all this hidden potential of characters he would introduce in this arc, but that's not the point, because Tuning Exams was still a good-ass arc. So why compare My Hero to it? Why not make a fair comparison? Like, I don't know, what about Black Clover's tournament arc? And some of you might look at this video and go, oh, look at him, he's sitting there, he's doing another comparison video so he can brag about Black Clover. No! It's just an excuse to talk about Black Clover some more. And also actually make a legit conversation, because, you know, we like doing that stuff here on YouTube, because it's not like we're doing that outside in social circles, right? Neckbeards? No? That joke dead yet? Probably is, it's fine. So I decided, let's do the video here. So, and the other reason why I wanted to do it was simply the fact that, hey, Black Clover's tournament arc was 21 chapters, and My Hero's tournament arc was 22 chapters. So they both use a very similar style in presenting their tournament arcs, which to me makes more sense in comparing. Take two authors who, by the way, are best friends in real life, and compare their two styles at the same kind of arc. Now, there are some variations and differences based off of how the story structure is between Black Clover and My Hero, but the general idea should still be able to be compared and contrasted and see what went well for one and what went bad for the other, or vice versa. So let's do that. So the first major difference is pretty much the timing of when these arcs happen. In My Hero, it's like, what, the second major arc of the series? And in Black Clover, it's like, what, the fourth or fifth major arc in the series? Because it takes place later in Black Clover, even though it still has the same general premise. Even though it has the same general premise, it still takes place in a different timeline of the story. So, what does that leave us with? Well, it leaves us with two arcs that essentially use different storytelling techniques, even though they use essentially the same kind of storytelling techniques. What? Now, for the other major difference, this is the way these arcs are structured. For example, Black Clover's is insanely straightforward. It's literally one premise from the beginning of the arc to the end of the arc, and that is, you're in teams of 3, you have a giant crystal behind you you need to defend, and if you break the other person's crystal before they break yours, that's it. You win and you move up to the next rank. That's all the Black Clover's tournament arc was, is that. You just had to do that many times, and then you won. My Heroes was split between a race, a cavalry battle where you had to grab headbands for points, and then you finished it off with the classic, I need to punch you in the face and knock you out before you punch me in the face and knock me out. So with that being stated, they both kind of allow for the same versatility. For example, because you have 3-man teams in Black Clover, not only do you get the introduction of a bunch of new characters and characters interacting with each other while also interacting with their opponents, but you also get a variation in terms of the battlefield, because the battlefield constantly changed in Black Clover's arc, even though it didn't really mean anything in the grand scheme of things, but that's not important. the advantage with having a different type of, but the difference also is because one takes place later in the story versus one takes place earlier in the story, they both have two different issues they need to overcome. For example, Hirokoshi for My Hero had to introduce a bunch of characters that weren't even established, let alone seen. For example, the biggest prolific group of characters they introduced were the Class B characters, who pretty much were just kind of being introduced with a few standouts. For the most part, it's like, there's another class, they're in the same tier as Class 1A, here's a few of the standouts you might want to meet early on, and then after that, we move to where the fucking plane is going off. Asshole. My Black Clover, on the other hand, because it waited later to do its own tournament arc, a bunch of those characters were already at least shown, and we knew the general basics of either their character or their power, so it wasn't like Tabata had to go through in a bunch of extra effort. He still introduced new characters, just like any tournament arc does, but it wasn't like a huge slew, whereas Hirokoshi had to. The other trade-off is that Hirokoshi also designed its battles around the idea that I only had a few characters I wanted to focus on, which is the major crux between the two and kind of their major difference. For example, the race is obviously a way of weeding out a bunch of fodder, because Hirokoshi's story takes place during a school setting. And in a school setting, you have a bunch of characters because it's a school. So what's an easy way to wipe out a bunch of people very quickly? Oh, a race! Also, because in interviews he's already mentioned that he primarily wanted this whole arc to be the push for Todoroki's development, which gets into that main crux of his tournament arc. That it was only primarily used to further Todoroki with some stuff for Deku and Bakugo. Meaning anything that happened in Hirokoshi's tournament arc focused around Bakugo, Deku, and Todoroki. And it was not an even split, I tell you. If you wanted to get percentages in here, I would say Bakugo's importance leans somewhere between like 10 and 15%. I would say Deku's leans somewhere between 25 and 30%. And I would say Todoroki's lands somewhere around 60 to maybe 55%. Why? Because Todoroki was the focus, and you can tell he was the focus. Black Clover, although has its characters it's focused around, it's not like a cut and dry. Every major or important event that happened was based around 3 characters. Actually, ironically enough, 2 of the most important characters in Black Clover's tournament arc are on the same team. Black Clover went from more of it's gonna be a short arc, but we just need to introduce and get some characters out there and just set up some things. Honestly, that's the difference between like modern tournament arcs, but these two, and like older tournament arcs. Older tournament arcs were way bigger of deals. They were deals in which it was like, yo, when a tournament goes down, it was life-changing. For example, the Dark Tournament in Yu Yu Hakusho was like that. The Tenkaichi tournaments in Dragon Ball were like that. They were huge events. That's why the King Piccolo fight and Goku fight took place during the tournament. That's how old school shonen and tuning exams being another perfect example. The old school way of handling tournaments is that tournaments were like shattering events. Whereas in modern shonen like Black Clover and My Hero, they're kind of just another arc. They don't mean much. It's just like, I'm going to use you as setup for another arc, or introduce things that will be used in other arcs, because both arcs do this. For example, some of the smaller moments in My Hero's arc, like Momo's crippling insecurity, the first signs of that start flaring up here. This is also the arc that formally introduces us to some of the 1A members we hadn't really messed with much, like Tokiyami. It doesn't really do much other than introducing you to his general personality and his abilities, but hey, it's something, and it's something different. We now know more about Tokiyami because of this arc. That's how My Hero does it. Same thing goes for Black Clover. You introduces Mimosa's brother in this arc. That's what it does. We didn't know who he was before. Now we know who she was now. If you don't get the joke, don't worry about it. It's funny because he looks like a girl. Comedy. me. But the major thing that's really different is that main difference in focus. Because like I said, because of how My Hero wanted to focus it around pretty much 3 characters, Black Clover kind of did a bunch of small little things. Each arc still has its main grand hype stage, and they do share a bunch of similarities. For example, the main character doesn't win either of these tournaments. Asta doesn't win, nor does Deku, but they do still have their major impactful fight. Asta versus Langris and Deku versus Todoroki. That's how it's weird, they share similarities, even though Black Clover's tournament arc happened later and later. What I mean by that is it's later because Black Clover was a newer shonen than My Hero, but also later because it happened later in the manga than it did for My Hero. The point I'm making though is they both took 2 different approaches to the same style. Black Clover being kind of a spread out thing where it wasn't like I'm going to focus on just Asta and just Zora and just Langris. There were other characters thrown in and out of the story with focuses on Yuno, focuses on Noelle, focuses on new characters like Ann and Kirsch. That's how Black Clover tried to handle it. In the same pretty much time frame, 21 chapters. Same as My Heroes. Same as My Heroes. They both tried to go for this quick style, rapid pace. I need to do like the bare minimum to get me moving into the next arc because all this is a setup. It doesn't really mean much in the grand scheme of things. Even in terms of the plot. Think about it. Sports festivals happen all the time and multiple times throughout their time in school. So this isn't even the only sports festival. So this obviously wasn't going to mean much in the grand scheme of things. It's just setup. And in terms of Black Clover, this was the whole point of the tournament arc in Black Clover was, who am I going to pick to come with me to go raid the Midnight Suns base? This had nothing to do with proving who was the best squad or who was raising the best new mages. This was literally, we are about to go raid on these guys that have been bugging the shit out of us for a while now. This tournament is to decide who deserves and who is strong enough to come. Because even if you lose in this tournament, if you were good enough or you showed off your abilities well enough or abilities to work with teams, guess what? You're coming with. So it wasn't even a tournament in terms of I need to win and become the very best, because it doesn't mean as much here in Black Clover. And that's kind of the point. They both handled it differently. Now, I personally kind of enjoy Black Clover style better because I got introduced to a way more variety of characters and had way more things and interesting things to say about. It's also because My Hero suffers from having a huge cast off jump, whereas Black Clover was slowly introducing new characters, even though its potential could be just as big as My Hero in terms of cast size. And like I said before, there were small things introduced here that would lead into more interesting things later. For example, introducing some of the Class B characters like Monoma, or Tetsu, or Kendo. These are characters who would later become more and more important as the story moved forward. But in the moment of the arc, it doesn't stick out as much. Even the Todoroki versus Deku fight, which isn't that interesting of a fight in itself, only holds weight because of also the difference in terms of writing styles. For example, Black Clover went out of its way to introduce and develop a character in the course of like 2 fights or something. Well, I'm specifically talking about Kirsch, where Kirsch was introduced as a pompous dickhead, and by the end of his actual fight with Asta, Zora, and Mimosa, kind of grew as a character. That's how Black Clover handles its character development, whereas My Hero tends to keep putting out these little seeds. These seeds of things that would come up later. For example, like I said earlier, the Momo example. Another example is kind of Kirishima and Tetsu's relationship, because that would be brought up a lot. Another issue is probably some of the other side characters, some of the 1AB members, and some of the 1A members that needed to be changed and developed. But that's just difference in styles. I think they both have their own place and own appeal to them. That's why one likes one or the other. The reason why but like I said, My Hero is also a series that is very emotion driven. I think, I've already said this numerous times, I think Black Clover has better fights, hands down, than My Hero does. But My Hero usually tends to have more impactful emotional moments because that's the style Hirokoshi goes for. He goes for the emotional moments. A lot of the reason why some of the best moments of My Hero are the best moments aren't really because the fight is very interesting or technical. It's because of the emotional backdrop that is surrounding the fight. That's why people geek the fuck out when you see the All Might versus All for One fight. Because the fight itself is literally an exchange of like a few punches, and someone surpassing their limits and punching with the strongest they can and then losing their ability. Like, the actual fight itself is like, you swing your strongest arm quirk at me and I swing yours, and we just throw them at each other and boom, and we collide and see what happens. That's the basic premise of that fight. The reason why it matters so much is because of the emotional backdrop on it. Not saying Black Clover doesn't do this, but Black Clover's main style never involves it to the degree that it happens in My Hero. That's why, and I think a good example of how good their emotional moments can be is things like Finral versus Langris or Zora versus Langris, where Finral's versus Langris is literally a clash between two brothers that there's a lot of emotional baggage behind. In that moment, it's cool as fuck, because it's like, boom, they're coming at each other with their special magic, and then all of a sudden, a flash happens. In the next scene, Finral is lost, and Langris is about to kill Finral, and there comes Magna, Asta, and Luck at his throat, like, put your hand down. That is an emotional moment that can still hit home in a very subtle way, but it's not as overblown or ridiculous as something like Deku and All Might's relationship, where it's like, you're an inspiration to me, but you can't be a hero because you don't have a quirk. And then he goes out there and risks his life even though he doesn't have a quirk, and it inspires All Might because it's like, you don't even have a quirk and you're still throwing yourself out there. That's what a true hero is. It doesn't have all that emotional weight immediately. Like, there's a bunch of baggage that is thrown at you in the moment that My Hero hits you with, whereas Black Clover tends to do it in like little bursts. So it never hits that same high, emotional high, because there's never like this giant bag being thrown at you. And that's kind of also the difference in their writing styles, that emotional weight. That's the reason why the Todoroki thing hits so hard. Not because it's an amazing fight, but because it mixes well with Hirokoshi's style, which is Todoroki and Deku are fighting. We're gonna slowly hint some things about his backstory, and then at the fight, in the middle of the fight, here's a bunch of baggage that hits you all at once, and now you're like, "Don't give up, Todoroki!" And then that's what makes people cry and scream out. But I think moments in which you got four of you, including Noelle, checking on Finral, but you have the Black Bulls coming out to defend a member of their team after he lost and was like, it's okay, fine, he lost, but you ain't about to kill him. That hits just as well, just in a different and maybe in a slightly smaller way. But I appreciate those moments nonetheless because they still work. Their tournament arcs, the battle style, unfortunately, I think the biggest issue I have with Hirokoshi's is that Hirokoshi's is obviously done in a way to cut down on the characters he has to use, because you could tell his goal had nothing to do with the majority of the cast anyway. He'll throw in some minor things and throw in some potential for setups, but his whole goal was, hey, I really want to make Todoroki more developed as a character. That's what we're going to do. And not to say Tabata didn't do the same thing with Black Clover with Zora. Zora was introduced and became just as prominent as I would say Todoroki would become later on, because it's like, hey, I want him in the story, I need to introduce him, and I need to push him throughout the arc. But it wasn't like he was always around all the time. Whereas Todoroki, you couldn't go like a chapter or two without seeing him. It was like, he needs to be around, or Deku needs to be thinking, or someone has to be talking about him, or his father needs to be talking about him. With Zora, although he was also a focus, there was stuff going on with Noelle, there was stuff going on with Yuno, there was stuff going on with Real, there was stuff going on with all these other characters to introduce and talk about, and it made it a more balanced arc. It just doesn't have that many highs because of it. And to be real, there aren't that many highs in My Hero's arc either. The main highs being maybe Bakugo versus Uraraka, which isn't that much of a high. It's more of a high for Uraraka than it is anything else. But once again, it's connected to Bakugo. That's part of that 10 to 15%. Deku versus Todoroki, the two headliners. Of course that was going to happen. And that actually might be the two major things. I think those were the two major fights. And maybe like a smaller fight with like Ito versus Todoroki, which still boils down to, look, the 60%'s in the screen, so therefore we're good. But you also still had the character development in the background with Deku, so it wasn't like he was completely lost in the background to Todoroki's shadow, because you still had the issue of him breaking himself and pretty much forsaking himself for other people. that's also whirling in the back, which makes things interesting. Whereas in Black Clover's case, there isn't really the same tier because Asta didn't really go through that. Asta just had his speech with Langris and how he thought of royals and how he wanted to fight with royals, but he also couldn't stand people like those royals who were fucking bigoted as shit. But that's not on the same tier as like bringing home the idea that you can't keep fighting this way. In Asta's situation, it was more of, I'm already got to climb a fucking steep ass mountain. Why are you making it rough for me when my goal isn't to beat you up? My goal is to stand with you. They're both interesting ideas, but the one that's obviously going to hit harder is the one that resonates with the main character. Not this general idea that needs to be talked about at the same point. I think they both hold their value, but they don't necessarily hit as hard when it comes to your viewer enjoyment of those series and their arcs. So they both have their pros and cons. I like one more than the other. I will say I generally enjoy Black Clover's tournament arc more than My Heroes, but it's also not fair because My Heroes took place way earlier in the series where it had way more to do. I would say that's the reason why My Heroes probably objectively is better, because it does have those heavy emotional moments that although Black Clover has, it also had more time to do stuff with, and its messages doesn't really hit as hard. Whereas that's kind of Hirokoshi's style, is to hit hard with its messages. That's what he does best. And like I said, he had to introduce a bunch of fucking characters, and he also it required more creativity because he had to keep changing. He had 3 different parts. It was 22 chapters, and he still had to have like 3 sections to this whole tournament arc: the race and the cavalry battle and the fighting. Whereas Black Clover just stuck to this one style. Now, in some ways, I can argue that Black Clover is still good because Black Clover, I think, has more interesting fights because of it. Because there was more variations. Now, it does have its bullshit ass, you do one move and everything's over shit. But it also does have some variety of fights, and you get to show off multiple characters in one situation. Whereas in the race, it didn't happen that much. In the cavalry battle, it was a little bit better. And in the final fights, they primarily skipped a bunch of them and only really focused on the characters that involved Deku, Bakugo, and Todoroki. But they both have their pros and cons, and they're both in the same short style. And the reality is that for modern shonen mangaka, they don't care to write a tournament arc in the same tier as like old school Yu Yu Hakusho or even Hunter x Hunter or even Naruto. They want to just, it's supposed to be just another arc to them. And that's why it's different. But please leave your thoughts and comments in the comment section below. Thank you guys for watching. Hope it was something interesting. Subscribe and follow the various social media in the description box. And as I always say, you can't have a little bit of fun if you're not going crazy to some extent. That was not the right way to say that. Fuck me, fuck me, fuck me!